Do you think you'd know how to recognize danger if it was standing right in front of you? Maybe you imagine evil reveals itself in screams, in clear actions, in cold stares. But what hurts the most rarely comes like that. The real poison comes disguised as care. It speaks softly, smiles kindly. Sometimes it hugs you, and that's how it gets in. Through the door of trust, through the space of intimacy. What Jung discovered is brutal and liberating at the same time. It's not the declared evil that hurts the most. It's the other's unconscious when it sneaks into our psychic field. Because every shadow that isn't recognized seeks a place to exist. And almost always, that place is you. Maybe you've never noticed, but try to remember. How many times have you left a conversation feeling more tired than when you started? How many times have you carried guilt that wasn't yours? Stories that didn't originate in you, but somehow ended up in your lap? Carl Jung called this projection an unconscious movement where the other dumps onto you everything they refuse to see in themselves. In that moment, you stop being seen. You stop being recognized as someone real. You become a mirror, an imaginary villain, a hero who never existed. And the cruelest part is this: none of those images are actually about you, but it's with them that they'll treat you. Imagine living with someone who turns your mere existence into guilt. Everything they feel becomes your responsibility. Every pain that crosses them lands on you. At first, it feels like affection. It feels like sensitivity. You see depth, vulnerability, maybe even beauty in the pain the other carries. But little by little, you start to sink. Because without realizing it, you've entered an emotional war zone, one you didn't create, and where you've already started losing. The unconscious manipulator doesn't have a plan. They don't do this out of malice. They do it because they don't know how to live any other way. They don't face their wounds. They don't listen to their shadows, and so they need someone to carry them for them. That someone is usually the one who loves the most. Jung said, "What we don't face in ourselves, we will meet as fate." And sometimes that fate has tender eyes, a soft voice, and sits next to you at the dinner table. The unconscious manipulator is inhabited by parts they themselves don't recognize. Old wounds, swallowed emotions, pains left in the dark for too long. Since they can't look at themselves, they look at you, and everything they can't bear in themselves, they start to see in your actions, in your words, in your silences. You become a stage, a canvas. The conflict isn't with you, but you're the one who takes the blows. And the most dangerous part is that it all happens in silence. No screams, no orders, just an invisible thread pulling at your soul slowly, every day. You start to doubt your feelings, to review every word you said, to wonder, was I insensitive? Am I the problem? That's how manipulation works, not with force, but with fragility, because the more empathy you offer, the deeper you sink. Jung warned, when we become symbols in someone else's unconscious story, we stop being seen as we are. You become a savior, an enemy, a distorted reflection of something the other refuses to integrate. The only way out? Awareness, recognize the trap, break the cycle, and above all, ask yourself with courage, this feeling I'm carrying, is it mine or was it planted in me? Because the unconscious manipulator doesn't invade with violence. They enter through the crack of your empathy. Not every danger screams. Some shine. The smile is always in place. The words are measured. The image polished. Everything seems right, maybe too right. We live in times where seeming is more valued than being, and little by little, the mask we wear for the world starts to stick to our face. Jung called this mask the persona, the role we learn to play to be accepted, loved, praised. But there's a point where the role stops being a choice and becomes a prison. When someone believes too much in their own performance, the soul starts to disappear beneath the costume. The persona, by itself, isn't the villain. It helps us exist in society, navigate roles, being a child, a professional, a friend. The problem starts when the role becomes identity, when the person believes they are what others expect to see. At that point, everything that's real, doubts, fragilities, spontaneous desires, gets locked in the basement of the psyche. The wearer of the persona becomes a master at seeming stable while crumbling inside, and those who live beside them feel it. They feel the lack of soul, the lack of presence. Everything sounds rehearsed, and the worst part, this demand for perfection spreads. You start adjusting too, hiding parts of yourself, following the script. Without realizing it, you start wearing a mask just to keep the conversation going. Jung saw this as one of the greatest dangers to self-knowledge. When someone falls in love with their own facade and forgets to listen to what's behind the glass, the more perfect the image, the more suffocated the essence. And the most tragic part is that this repression doesn't vanish, it builds up, and sooner or later, it demands its price. The wearer of the persona doesn't live, they perform. And the performance demands that everyone around them join the play too. You find yourself measuring words, hiding what you feel, avoiding any move that might threaten to break the illusion. Because in this theater, real emotion is a threat, and truth is noise. There are people who live as if they were made of porcelain, always calm, always right, always composed. They seem to have conquered chaos, but what they've really done is buried it. Behind the exemplary balance, there's an invisible tension. Everything they judge as wrong, anger, envy, desire, impulse, has been locked in the dark, not healed, exiled. Jung called this the shadow, what you don't want to be, but still exists in you. And the more you try to erase that part, the stronger it grows in the darkness, because what isn't embraced takes revenge. The owner of the repressed shadow doesn't explode randomly, but when they do, it's like decades spill out at once. Until then, they live controlled, impeccable. But you feel something strange, a subtle discomfort, as if every word you say is being judged by an invisible court. This person can't tolerate mistakes, not in others, not in themselves. Because any intense emotion threatens the castle they've built to keep their own shadow under control. The stronger the facade, the more dangerous the darkness hidden behind it. Jung said, "The more light you pretend to be, the denser the shadow you ignore becomes." And those who live nearby feel it in their bodies, as if they're walking on glass all the time. The cruelest part is that often these people are admired. They're seen as examples of balance, ethics, composure, but inside, they're fighting a silent war, and those who live with them bear the weight of what's locked away. Veiled criticism, heavy silences, demands that crush. It's not malice, it's accumulated repression, because what you bury alive doesn't die, it waits. And when it finally shows up, it doesn't come just as anger. It comes as bitterness, as resentment, as coldness disguised as reason. Jung reminded us, the shadow isn't just what's ugly in us. It also carries our vitality, our strength, our lost creativity. But when repressed, that strength turns to poison, and the poison always leaks out. Not every oppressor shouts. Some whisper with the voice of virtue. They don't raise weapons, they raise standards. They coat rigidity in the cloak of morality. They point out flaws as if they're saving, but they wound as if they're punishing. On the outside, they seem just. On the inside, they're at war with what they deny in themselves. Jung saw this archetype with keen eyes. Every time someone positions themselves as the guardian of truth, there's a shadow being shoved into the basement. And the greater the effort to seem pure, the darker the part being rejected becomes. In place of empathy, judgment is born. And where there could be connection, control takes over. The moral controller doesn't see people, they see flaws. Everything becomes a correction, a reprimand disguised as care. They say they want to help, that it's for your own good, but what they really want is to keep intact the image they've built of themselves. Jung explained, the projected shadow becomes a warped mirror, and in that mirror, the other becomes everything the person refuses to see in themselves. If you live near someone like this, you feel like you're always owing something, like you're wrong just for being who you are. Little by little, you start pruning yourself. You fit into the other's expectations. You lose yourself in the idea of being good. In Jung's eyes, extreme moralism doesn't reveal virtue, it reveals escape. Someone who needs to police the world with such severity is afraid to face their own abyss, and the more they control the other, the less they connect with their own truth. The result is an environment where spontaneity dies suffocated, where silence weighs more than words, where guilt becomes routine. You start living lightly, feeling guilty for feeling, and little by little, you start to believe your soul is wrong. But it's not you who's wrong. It's the psychic prison built around you, made of rules that don't heal, only punish. Because the moral controller doesn't want dialogue, they want submission. The greatest rebellion is to remain human. There are bonds that feel like emotional roller coasters. One moment, there's affection. The next, chaos. You smile, and without understanding why, someone's face darkens. You make a light gesture, a simple joke, and the atmosphere shifts color. Living with someone dominated by complexes is like this. Everything is unstable, everything is personal, everything is a trigger. Jung explained, complexes are unresolved emotional fragments lying in wait within the psyche. They don't ask permission. They take the wheel without warning. And when that happens, the person stops responding to the present and starts reacting to ghosts of the past. The most confusing part is that these outbursts aren't constant. They're interspersed with sweetness, affection, sincere regret. And that's what keeps you hooked. You remember the good parts. You believe maybe you can avoid the bad ones. So you start molding yourself, measuring words, walking on tiptoes, always trying to avoid the next collapse. But here's the painful truth. The problem was never you. What you trigger was already there. It was just touched. Jung said that complexes don't just influence, they take over consciousness. And in that state, the person doesn't see you. They see a disguised memory, a recycled trauma, an old enemy with your face. Being beside someone dominated by complexes is living on constant alert. You never know what you'll wake up, the person or their past. And the more you try to bring stability, the more you sink into the effort to contain something that isn't yours. You start to forget who you were before this. Your light dims slowly, like someone turning it off to avoid conflict. But no matter how hard you try, the storm comes. Because it's not provoked, it's carried within. Jung reminded us, everything that isn't emotionally digested ends up being vomited onto those nearby. And the only way not to get lost in this cycle is to recognize that the hole the other tries to pull you into wasn't born in you. You were just too close when it opened. Some people don't want company, they want fuel. They don't ask for space, they drain presence, and they don't do it with shouts or threats. They do it with long silences, guilt-laden phrases, neediness disguised as love. Jung might not have used the term, but he knew this figure well. The psychic vampire, the one who can't sustain their own soul and needs to feed on yours. They don't want to grow, they want to be carried, and they do it with an almost invisible skill. You offer a shoulder, then your time, then you start to lose yourself. At first it feels like affection, like intimacy, but over time you notice The relationship demands more than it gives. You start feeling guilty for needing space, for saying no, for being tired. The psychic vampire is a master at flipping roles. They seem fragile, but they dominate. They seem needy, but they manipulate. And without realizing it, you're living to avoid a crisis, to not disappoint, to not be another person who abandons. Jung spoke of symbiotic relationships, bonds where the other doesn't recognize you as a separate being, but as an extension of themselves. That's what this bond does. It dissolves your boundaries. You no longer know where you end and where the other begins. The exhaustion isn't just physical, it's psychic. You feel like you're always owing, always needing to explain, soothe, sustain something that isn't yours. And the cruelest part is that the more you give, the less you exist. Jung taught us that the path to individuation, to becoming whole, requires symbolic separation. It requires recognizing, this pain isn't mine. This void isn't my duty to fill. The psychic vampire doesn't want sharing. They want fusion. But real love doesn't dissolve. It preserves the other's space. And emotional sovereignty begins when you decide to return to yourself, even if it costs silence, even if it costs leaving. Maybe, while listening to each of these profiles, you thought of someone. Or maybe you saw yourself. And that's not a mistake. It's a beginning. Jung said that we all have a shadow. We've all projected, fled, hurt without knowing. The difference lies in who chooses to see. Seeing takes courage. It takes silence. It takes the choice to stop distracting yourself from yourself. This video wasn't about pointing fingers. It was about turning on lights. Because when you recognize the invisible, it stops controlling you. If this resonated with you, maybe it's time to go deeper. There's a quiet path that begins when you choose yourself, for real. And if you want to follow that journey, subscribe, not out of obligation, but because maybe it's time to not lose yourself again.